She was the bruised at the auction. A retired boxer rancher chose her and left his fists behind. The last time I made a fist that counted for something, I was 34 years old, and a man named Cutter Doyle went down on the sawdust floor of a barn outside Laramie and didn't get back up for a long while. Long enough that I stood there watching his chest to be sure it was still moving. Long enough that the crowd went quiet. That was the last fight I took money for. I walked out of that barn with $40 and a feeling like I'd swallowed creek mud, and I didn't fight for pay again. That was 22 years before the auction. I want to tell you about the auction. But to tell it right, I have to tell you about my hands first, because my hands are where this story lives. They're not something I'm proud of, and they're not something I'm ashamed of either. They're just what I am, what I was built into, same as a man who works forge iron his whole life comes out with forearms like ham hocks whether he wanted them or not. My hands are big. The knuckles ride high and permanent, like ridge lines on a map. There's a knob on the outside of my right hand where I broke a metacarpal in a bout in Cheyenne in 1871, and the bone healed a little sideways. You can feel it when you shake my hand. Women used to flinch a little. Men used to hold on longer than they needed to, testing something. I bought the Arroyo Seco place in the spring of 1879. 60 acres of rough graze and a creek that ran honest about 8 months out of 12. The house had been empty 3 years, and the previous man had left in a hurry, which I didn't ask about, and the county clerk didn't offer. I paid $400 in cash money, shook the clerk's hand. He held on longer than he needed to, and drove out that afternoon with a wagon load of seed, wire, and a cast iron cook stove I'd bought off a widow in town. The first year I lost 2 steers to a mudslide after a wet spring, broke the handle off a good post hole digger, and built a fence line by myself that took me the better part of 3 months. Nights I ate beans and read whatever I could get my hands on by lamplight. I had a Gideon Bible and a 2-year-old Denver newspaper, and a book on the geology of the Great Plains that I'd found left on a wagon seat outside a dry goods. I read that geology book probably 4 times. I still know more about Cretaceous sediment than any rancher in this county has a right to. I wasn't lonely, or I was, but I'd been lonely before, and I knew the feeling wasn't going to kill me. What I was mostly was tired of what I used to be and working hard at being something else. A man who used to fight for money has a reputation that travels ahead of him. I'd come up from Colorado specifically to get ahead of mine, but reputation is patient. It caught up to me by the 2nd summer, when a fellow named Haskell rode out to my place on the pretense of buying some fence posts, and before he left got around to asking if I'd be interested in a bare-knuckle arrangement out behind the Whitmore granary on a Saturday night. I told him I was retired. He said the money was good. I told him again. He looked at my hands the way men do, that inventory look, measuring something, and then he left. Haskell came back twice more that year with better numbers. The 3rd time I didn't answer the door. By the 4th year I had a decent herd, a new roof on the barn, and a name in the county that was starting to be about the ranch and less about the fists. I wasn't friends with many people, but I was known as a straight dealer, a man who paid what he owed and kept his word. The Delacroix brothers 2 valleys over would send work my way sometimes when they were overrun. I'd help them with a gather. They'd come pull fence with me in the spring. That was the extent of my social life, and it suited me. I had a dog for a while, a yellow mutt I called Cobb, short for nothing in particular, just a word I liked. He died in the winter of 1882, old age, and I buried him by the creek in frozen ground, and it took me 2 hours with a pickaxe to get down 18 inches. I am mentioning this only because of what happened later at the auction with the dog. You'll understand when I get there. The auction was in Millhaven, which was the nearest town of any size, 14 miles east on a road that was good for 6 months and honest mud for the other 6. They held a big livestock and equipment auction every fall last week of September, when the ranchers and farmers were wrapping up the season and either needed to shed animals before winter feeding got expensive or needed to acquire something before the cold set in for good. I'd been going 3 years running, mostly to buy and sometimes to sell. I knew the auctioneer, a man named Pierce who had a voice like a locomotive and a genuine gift for reading a crowd. I knew most of the ranchers from the surrounding valley. It was not what I'd call a social event for me, but I was comfortable there. I knew my place in it. The 1883 auction was on a Wednesday. I remember that specifically because I'd had to move things around to go. I had a section of fence down on the south pasture from a storm the week before, and I'd planned to spend that Wednesday fixing it. and I delayed it to go to the auction because I needed to look at a particular draft horse I'd heard about. A big gray Belgian that a homesteader on the far side of the Bitterroot Range was selling off because he was leaving the territory. That Belgian was the reason I was there, just the horse. I got into Millhaven around 9 in the morning. The auction grounds were already full, wagons in rows, horses tied along the fence, the smell of dung and hay and wood smoke from the food sellers along the south edge of the grounds. I went and looked at the Belgian, whose name was Walter, which struck me as a very serious name for a horse. He was sound. Good feet, clear eyes, no wind problems that I could hear. He was maybe 8 years old and bigger than advertised, which I took as a good sign since most sellers shave a little off on size and add a little on quality. I decided I'd go to $110 on him and not $1 more. I had 2 hours before the livestock portion of the auction started. I walked the grounds some, drank a cup of coffee from one of the food sellers. It was terrible coffee, the grounds not fully settled, almost chewy. And then I drifted toward the north end where they were running what the auction broadsheet called a property and effects portion. This was the miscellaneous end, the sad end really, where people sold what they couldn't carry anymore or what the bank had pushed them out of. Furniture, tools, harness, a quilt here, a set of dishes there. I wasn't buying anything there, I was just walking. There was a section I hadn't seen before at the Millhaven auction, though I'd heard it happened at some of the eastern ones. They called it a domestic services lot. What it was, in plain terms, was women and sometimes older children being presented for hire or placement. It wasn't slavery, those days were done, but it walked right up to the edge of something uncomfortable. These were women who had, for one reason or another, no other options in that moment. Debt, dead husbands. Families that had failed or abandoned them. They'd go with whoever hired them for a term, for a wage that was paid to the auction house first, and then passed back minus a fee. I hadn't planned to stop there, I stopped. There were 4 women standing at the north fence when I walked past. 2 of them looked composed, resigned, the way a person looks when they've made a hard decision and are past the point of second-guessing it. One was young, maybe 18, and she was holding herself together with visible effort, her hands clasped in front of her so tight the knuckles were white. And one. The 4th one. She was standing slightly apart from the others. Not apart by much, maybe 2 feet, but in a line of 4 people even 2 feet means something. She was maybe 30, somewhere in that range. It was hard to say because she had the look of someone who'd been through weather, and weather ages a person. Dark hair pulled back hard. A dress that had been good quality once, a dark blue wool but was worn at the elbows and had been let down at the hem, you could see the seam where it had been. She was not small, but she held herself small, the way a person does when they've learned that taking up space causes problems. And she had a bruise on the left side of her face. Along the cheekbone, down toward the jaw. It was 3 or 4 days old, yellow-green at the edges, still dark purple at the center, the kind that still pulled the eye of the skin around it. Someone had hit her with a closed fist, I'd guess. I know what that kind of bruise looks like better than I'd like to. I stood there probably longer than was polite. She didn't look at me. There was a man circling the north fence, not the auctioneer but a handler of some kind, a thick-necked fellow with a sheepskin vest who was answering questions from the men who stopped to look. 2 men were asking about the young one. One man was standing near the composed-looking women, saying something I couldn't hear. No one was near the woman with the bruise. I kept walking. I got maybe 30 feet. I want to be honest about this next part, because I've turned it over in my mind enough times that I know what it was and what it wasn't. It wasn't a chivalrous impulse, or not only that. It wasn't pity, or not mainly. What happened is that I stopped walking because something in me, some old, cold reading instinct that I'd developed in the years when reading a man's body was how you stayed alive in a ring. Something in me had looked at that woman and logged something, and it took 30 feet, and about 10 steps before it surfaced into actual thought. She was afraid, not the way the young one was afraid, which was visible and immediate and right on the surface. She was afraid the deep way, the way that's learned, the way that's been there long enough that a person organizes their whole body around managing it. The held small posture. The way her eyes moved across the crowd, not looking for something, looking for a threat, running inventory on every approaching man the way a person does when they've learned that approaching men are a source of danger. And she was alone at that fence while everyone else had at least one person nearby, and I thought, nobody's going to take her. Not with that bruise. Not with that look. She was going to stand there all day and nobody was going to hire her because men would see the bruise and either assume she'd caused trouble or assume she came with trouble attached to her. And either way she'd go back to wherever she'd come from at the end of the day, and whatever that situation was, it had already put one mark on her face. I turned around. The handler's name was DuPont, I learned later. He had a little notebook and a pencil stub behind his ear. I walked up to him and said, quietly, so as not to make a scene of it, that I was interested in the placement terms for the woman in the blue dress. He looked at me. He looked at her. He seemed to run some kind of assessment in his head, and then he pulled out the notebook. Her name was written there as Nora Voss. The term was 6 months, standard domestic, meaning cooking and keeping house and whatever light ranch work she was able and willing to do. The wage was $12 a month, of which the auction house took $2 for their fee and she received $10. I would be responsible for her board and any medical needs. At the end of 6 months, the arrangement could be renewed by mutual agreement. I said fine. DuPont asked if I wanted to speak with her first. I said no, I didn't need to. He looked at me a little sideways at that, and I understood why most men in this arrangement wanted to do a kind of inspection, ask questions, make the woman demonstrate she could cook or that she was strong enough for such and such a task. I didn't want to do that. She was a person, not a draft horse. I said I'd take the term and I'd pay now. While I was paying DuPont, I heard footsteps on the packed earth behind me, and then she was standing at my left side, not close, a careful distance. And she said, "Excuse me." I turned. She was looking at me with an expression that I couldn't read clearly, which surprised me, because I'm usually not bad at reading faces. It was careful, measuring. There was no gratitude in it, not at that moment, which I respected more than I would have respected gratitude. She said, "Before we go any further, I need to say something." I said, "All right." "I'm not going to be pushed around," she said. "Whatever arrangement this is, I'll work hard and I'll do what's reasonable and I'll keep your house, but I'm not going to be pushed around." She said it plain, the way you say something you've rehearsed because you know you'll need it. And while she said it, she was looking at my hands. Not the way men look at them, not that measuring inventory look. She was looking at them the way someone looks at a loaded weapon that they're trying to assess. I said, "I don't push women around." She said, "I've heard that before." I said, "I expect you have." There was a silence. The auction noise was all around us. Pierce's voice carrying from somewhere west, cattle sounds, a hammer ringing somewhere. I said, "My name is Cord Ballantyne. I have a ranch 14 miles out. You'd have your own room, which is a small room off the kitchen, but it has a door with a latch. I'll show you where the latch is the first thing when we get there. 3 meals a day. The work is not light, but it's not cruel." She was still looking at my hands. I put them in my pockets. Not to hide them, it wasn't that calculated. It was just that it seemed like the thing to do. She said, "All right, Mr. Ballantyne." I went and bought the Belgian. He cost me $95, which was better than I'd expected, and a man named Torbert from the next valley over had pushed the bid up to 89 before he apparently hit his ceiling and dropped out. Afterward, I brought the horse around to the west gate where I'd left my wagon, and Nora Voss was already standing there waiting. She had a canvas bag, one of those flour sack bags that people use for everything, slung over one shoulder. That was everything she had. She looked at Walter. She said, "That's a serious horse." I said, "His name's Walter." She said, "Of course it is." And I'll tell you, that was the first unexpected thing she said, and it landed somewhere. Not soft, it was wry, it was dry, it was the kind of thing a person says when they're surprised out of their composure for just a second. It was the first moment since I'd turned around at that north fence that she seemed like a whole person rather than a situation. I helped her up onto the wagon bench. She took my hand to step up, the first time she'd touched me, and her grip was firm and quick, just the necessary contact, and she let go the second she was up. We drove 14 miles without talking much. That was fine. The road was bad in spots, and I had to manage Walter, who was new and still figuring out the wagon traces, and the weather had that cold bite that comes in September in this country when the sun is out, but the air remembers that winter is close. She sat with the flour sack bag in her lap and looked at the country going past. About halfway out, she said, without turning her head, "Where'd you fight?" I said, "Beg pardon." She said, "You were a fighter. Where'd you fight?" I said, "How do you know that?" She turned and looked at me then. She said, "Your nose has been broken, your ear on the right side is thickened, and your hands." She paused. My father fought for 20 years out of a camp in Ohio. I know what a fighter's hands look like. I said Laramie, Cheyenne. One bout in Denver, before that Colorado. She said, did you win mostly? I said, mostly. She turned back to the road. She said, my father won mostly too. I didn't ask what that meant. Some things you don't push at. The ranch looked the way ranches look in September, the grass going dry and golden, the creek running lower. I pulled up to the house, and she stepped down before I could offer a hand, independent, taking stock of the place the way I'd watched her take stock of me. I showed her the kitchen room first, then her room. The latch on the door was a good iron one, heavy. I showed her where it was and how it worked, the pin that dropped into the bracket, and she put her fingers on it and worked it twice without any comment. I showed her the pump, the woodpile, the root cellar where I kept the pantry stores. She asked several direct, practical questions. Where did I keep the water bucket at night? Where was the broom? Did I have a preference about breakfast time? I answered them. She said, do you have animals other than that horse? I said I had 11 cattle and some chickens. The chickens were in the coop east of the house. She said, I can manage chickens. I said, I'd be grateful. She said, it's not gratitude, it's the arrangement. I said, fair enough. That night she cooked the first meal, beans and salt pork and cornbread, which was what I had in the larder to work with. We ate at the table. She sat across from me. She ate like someone who'd been hungry recently, but was trying not to show it, steady and measured, not rushing but clearing the bowl. I got up and refilled her bowl without asking and set it back down, and she looked at the refilled bowl for a moment, and then she said thank you in a low voice and kept eating. After she'd gone to her room and I heard the latch drop, that soft iron sound, heavy, definite, I sat by the lamp for a while. I wasn't thinking anything organized. I was aware of the house feeling different, the particular difference of another person's presence, sounds I'd stopped expecting, the small creak of the cot in her room when she lay down. I went to bed. The first month was careful. We were two people learning the edges of each other, testing what was solid and what would give. She was up before me every morning, which I hadn't expected. I'm an early riser, first gray of light, and I'd get up to find the stove already going and coffee made. Not great coffee early on. She asked me after the first week how I liked it, and I told her honest, and she adjusted, and after that it was better. She was a worker, that I'll say plainly, she worked. Not the anxious, prove-yourself kind of work that people do when they're scared of what'll happen if they stop, but a steady, competent, thoughtful kind. She didn't need to be told things twice. She figured out the lay of the ranch by observation, where things were and why they were there, and she organized herself around it without rearranging what was already organized. Which I respected, because a person who comes into someone else's place and starts moving things around to suit themselves without asking is telling you something about how they think the world works. There was one morning, maybe 3 weeks in, when I came in from the barn at mid-morning, and she was on the roof of the kitchen extension, just up there with a hammer, nailing down a piece of cedar shingle that had come loose. She'd found the shingles in the barn, found the hammer, gotten the ladder up herself, and climbed up without a word about it. I stood in the yard looking up at her. I said, what are you doing? She said, what does it look like? I said, how'd you know it was loose? She said, I could feel the draft in the kitchen corner when the wind is out of the northwest. Took me a week to find where it was coming from. I looked up at her for another moment. She drove the nail home with 3 clean strokes and moved to the next. I said, all right. She said, I can come down if you need something. I said, no, keep going. She kept going. That evening I told her that if she found things that needed fixing and she had the wherewithal to fix them, she should go ahead and fix them, and I'd keep the barn stocked with the materials she might need. She said that was acceptable. That was about as much praise as she gave or I offered during that first month. It was a working arrangement. We kept to that. What I didn't know for most of that first month was the shape of what she'd come from. I'd pieced together a little. The bruise had told me one thing, the practiced posture another, the comment about her father a third. But I hadn't pushed and she hadn't offered. The full picture came at the end of the month, not all at once, but in the way things come out when two people have lived in close quarters long enough that the effort of not saying a thing starts to cost more than saying it. We were at the table after supper. I'd poured 2 cups of coffee. I'd started doing that, pouring two without asking, and she'd stopped declining, and she had both hands around her cup and she was looking at the lamp flame. Then she said, "The man who hit me was my husband." I didn't say anything. She said, "He died in July, kicked by a horse." She paused. "I know what that sounds like." I said, "What does it sound like?" She said, "Like I might have had something to do with it." I said, "Did you?" She said, "No, though I won't pretend I grieved." There was a silence. She was still watching the flame. She said, "After he died there were debts I didn't know about. His brother contested the property. I had no family of my own nearby. My people are from Missouri and my parents are dead, and my brother is somewhere in California I haven't heard from in 4 years. The brother won the property claim. He gave me 3 weeks to get out." She looked up from the flame and looked at me. "I want you to know that I am not a woman who gives up easily. I want you to understand that the auction was what was left, not the first thing I tried." I said, "I can see that." She said, "I tried 3 situations in town first. One was a boarding house that turned out to want something other than cleaning. One was a family that wanted me to work 14 hours and sleep in a closet. One was a man who I knew within 10 minutes would hit me." I said, "But you took the 4th. She said, "I took the 4th. She looked back at the flame. "You." The way she said it, not soft, not with any particular warmth in it yet, but with something that was the beginning of settling. Like a thing that's been balanced wrong finding its level. I said, "You made the right call." She said, "I'm starting to think so." That was all. We finished our coffee and she went to her room and I heard the latch drop and I sat by the lamp a while. I didn't tell her about my own history that night. I'd already told her the bones of it on the wagon and she'd read the rest off my hands. But there was more to it than the fighting. There was the reason I'd stopped, the barn in Laramie and Cutter Doyle on the sawdust, the mud feeling in my chest walking out with $40. I'd left a man who didn't deserve what I did to him half dead on a floor, and I'd never been able to fully settle with that. The ranch was partly my attempt to build something that wasn't about damage. I didn't tell her all of that, not yet. The weather turned hard in October. Not the worst start to winter I'd seen in this country, but not gentle either. 2 early storms that brought sleet rather than snow, the kind that coats everything in a thin glaze of ice that makes every task take twice as long and is harder on the animals than full snow would be. I lost one young steer to the cold. I found him down by the creek, which he shouldn't have been near in that weather, and I don't know what drew him out there. I put him out of it and cut what meat I could from him in the cold and left the rest. Nora handled the cold without complaint. She'd grown up in Missouri, she said, and Missouri winters were wet cold, which she considered worse than dry cold. She layered up and kept the house warm and kept the chickens alive when it would have been easy to let a couple of them go. One evening in the 2nd week of October, I came in later than usual from the barn. One of the cattle had got her leg tangled in some old wire near the fence line, and I'd spent an hour in the cold and dark getting her free and treating the cuts. And when I came in, Nora had held dinner past when she usually would have, which she didn't have to do. I sat down at the table and my hands were cold enough they weren't working right, stiff and slow, and she put a plate in front of me, and then without any remark she got a basin of warm water from the stove and set it on the floor beside my chair. I looked at the basin, I looked at her. She said, "Your hands, put them in." I put my hands in the warm water. The cold came out of them slowly, that particular ache knuckle-deep, coming up through the palms. She sat across from me. She didn't watch my hands in a way that was uncomfortable. She just sat there and drank her coffee, and after a few minutes she said, "Eat before it goes cold." And I pulled my hands out of the basin and ate, and they worked better. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say she paid attention to the world. She'd noticed my hands that first day on the wagon, logged them, assessed them, made a determination, and she noticed them again that night, and she did something about it, practical, no ceremony. She didn't ask if I was all right. She just handled it. A man doesn't forget that. We started talking more during October. Not in long stretches, but in the particular way of people who live and work alongside each other, where conversation happens in pieces around other things, at meals, between tasks, in the odd moment when the work pauses. She asked about the Belgian, and I told her about the Delacroix brothers and the help trade we'd worked out over the years. She told me about her father, the Ohio fighter. His name had been Gerald Voss. He'd fought middleweight for most of his career. And he'd been, she said, A gentle man in every room except the one with the ring in it. She said he'd had knuckles like mine. I said, was he good to your mother? She said, very, which is why I thought a fighter could be a decent man. I just picked the wrong one. I said, you picked better this time. She looked at me for a moment in a way I couldn't fully read. Then she said, we'll see. But she said it differently than she'd said things in that first month. There was something in the edge of it, not a challenge, more like a door left slightly open. I thought about that after. I thought about it probably more than I should have. November. The fence on the south pasture, the one I'd delayed fixing to go to the auction, finally got my full attention in the first week of November, before the ground froze too hard to work the posts. It was a full day's work longer, and I started it alone, and by early afternoon I'd gotten about half of it done when Nora appeared with the post-hole digger over her shoulder and a canteen. I said, you don't have to do this. She said, the ground's soft enough today. Tomorrow it might not be. You won't finish before dark working alone. She was right, I didn't argue. We worked the rest of the afternoon together. She'd done this kind of work before. She had good form with the digger, using her body weight rather than trying to muscle it, which is the right way. She didn't chatter while she worked. Neither did I. The sound was the digger going in, the click of rocks, the wire being stapled, the posts going down. Good sounds, work sounds. At one point she hit a rock at about 18 inches and couldn't drive the digger any deeper, and she looked at it. And then she looked at me, and I came over and worked it loose with a bar. It took both of us getting underneath it, and we levered it up out of the ground together, this big, flat, gray thing. And when it finally came out, she sat back on her heels and said, that was rude of it. I laughed. I don't laugh easily, and I surprised myself with it. A short bark of a sound, but genuine. She looked up at me. Something crossed her face, something I might call the beginning of ease. We finished the fence by last light. She made supper late, potatoes and venison from a buck I'd taken the week before, and we ate in the lamplight, and I noticed that she'd started sitting with her chair maybe 6 inches closer to the table's center than she had in the first weeks, which doesn't sound like much but meant she was sitting 6 inches closer to the lamp and 6 inches closer to me, and I don't think she'd done it consciously, but I noticed it. After supper, I said, I'm going to tell you something about myself. You don't have to receive it as anything in particular. I just think you ought to know it. She set her cup down. She waited. I told her about the barn in Laramie. Not every detail, but the shape of it. The fight with Cutter Doyle, the $40 walking out, the mud feeling. I told her that I'd built the ranch in part to be away from what I'd been, and that there were days I wasn't sure I'd gotten away far enough. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, how many men did you hurt badly? I said, one that I know of, probably others in lesser ways. You don't come out of that trade without leaving a mark on someone. She said, did you ever hurt anyone who hadn't agreed to be there? I said, no. She said, then you were a violent trade, not a violent man. I sat with that. I said, that's a distinction. She said, it's an important one. I said, you sound like you've thought about that. She said, my father thought about it his whole life. He made the same distinction, and I think he was right. She picked up her cup again. The man who hit me didn't fight for money and wasn't a violent trade. He was just a violent man. She said it flatly, not for effect, just as a fact. I said, he won't hit anyone else. She said, no, he won't. The lamp flame bent a little in some draft I couldn't trace and came back up. She was looking at the table, and I was looking at her, at the near-healed bruise. It was almost gone by then, just a faint discoloration. And I thought about the north fence at that auction, about 30 feet of packed earth and the 10 steps I'd taken before I turned around. I thought, I'm glad I turned around. I didn't say that. It wasn't the time. December came in cold and stayed cold. The kind of December this country makes when it's serious, not the romantic cold of the dime novels, not the Christmas card cold, but a real still gray cold where the temperature drops at night and stays dropped, and the world gets very quiet and very hard and very simple in the way that life gets when the margin between comfort and danger gets small. I was glad for the wood I'd put up in September. I was glad for the root cellar. I was glad, in a way I hadn't anticipated being glad about anything in a long time, for the company. We spent evenings by the stove. She'd taken to the geology book, she'd found it, looked at it, asked if she could read it, and I'd said of course, and now she read it with an attention that pleased me for some reason I didn't examine too closely. She'd ask questions about it sometimes. Good questions. She had a mind that liked to get underneath things. One evening she said, without looking up from the book, "Did you know this county is sitting on about 200 feet of Cretaceous marine sediment?" I said I did actually. She looked up. She said, "You've read this." I said 4 times. She considered that. She said, "What else do you read?" I told her, mostly what I could get my hands on. Newspapers when they came through, which was irregular. A legal history of Wyoming territory that a lawyer in Millhaven had lent me and never asked back. The Bible, though I wasn't particularly religious, I read it the way I'd read the geology book, for the knowledge of what it contained. She nodded at each of these like she was filing them away. Then she said, "I have a book in my bag. I haven't gotten it out because I wasn't sure. I didn't want to take up space." I said, "Take up space, it's your room." She went and got it. It was a collection of essays by a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft, published originally in England in 1792 and clearly second or third hand by the time it had gotten to Nora Voss. The spine was cracked, and there were pencil notations in 2 different hands in the margins. She handed it to me carefully, the way you hand something that matters to someone. I looked at it, I read the title. I said, "All right." She said, "Have you heard of her?" I said, "No." She said she believed that women were capable of reason equal to men, and that the law ought to reflect that. I said she was right. Nora looked at me steadily. She said, "You say that easily." I said, "Was I supposed to argue?" She said, "Most men argue." I said, "Most men are foolish about some things." There was a pause, then she almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the near thing, the shape the face makes before it gets there, and it was the most unguarded I'd seen her. I looked back down at the book, so she'd have room to put her face back together. Christmas in this country, when you're not in a town and you don't have family, is mostly just another cold day that you've given a name to. I'd stopped doing much about it years back, maybe a better meal, that was all. But I had money put aside from the fall, and I rode into Millhaven in the week before Christmas, and I bought some things. Coffee of a better quality than I usually kept, a tin of hard candies, and in the dry goods, almost as an afterthought, though it wasn't an afterthought, a book. A novel by Dickens, one of the thick ones, which I knew because of the Wyoming lawyer I'd borrowed it from and given back. I wrapped it in brown paper. Christmas morning, I put it on the table at her place setting. She came in from checking the chickens, stomped the cold off her boots and saw it. She stood there for a moment, then she sat down and unwrapped it. She looked at it, she turned it over. She looked up at me and I thought for a moment that something was going to break loose in her face, something that she'd been keeping held together since that first morning. But she was a woman who'd learned control, and the control held. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Ballantyne." She'd been calling me that since September, Mr., the distance of it. I said, "It's cord." She said it just once, cord, trying it out. I made breakfast. She sat at the table with the Dickens open. January was the hardest month. It always was. 2 things happened in January that I need to tell you about, and they're connected in a way that I understood only later. The first was that a man came to the ranch. He came on a Wednesday, mid-morning, which is how I know it was a Wednesday because I'd been splitting wood, and I always split wood on Wednesday mornings in winter, the regularity of it having become a kind of anchor point in the week. I heard a horse on the road, and then a rider turned in at the gate and came up the track. He was a big man on a dun horse. He wore a buffalo coat that had seen better decades and a hat pulled down against the cold. He rode up to the yard and stopped. I was still holding the maul. I'd set it down beside me when I heard the horse, but I'd picked it back up, not as a weapon habit, just a thing in the hand. He said, "You the man that bought a woman named Nora Voss at the Millhaven auction in September." I said, "Who's asking?" He said, "My name is Lester Voss, her husband's brother." I looked at him. He was maybe 45, heavy in the shoulders, with the kind of face that had once been stronger and was now just thick. There was a way he sat the horse, easy, proprietary, that told me he was a man used to getting what he wanted by simply moving toward it. I said, "What do you want?" He said, I want to speak with her. I said, she's not available. He said, I didn't ask if she was available. I said I wanted to speak with her. I said, I heard what you said. I was aware of the kitchen door behind me. I didn't look at it. I heard it open, and I heard Nora's footsteps on the boards coming out, and I wanted to turn and tell her to go back in, but I didn't because she was a grown woman, and she'd told me plainly in September that she wasn't going to be pushed around, and I didn't think that was a one-direction rule. She came and stood to my right and about a step back. I could see Lester Voss looking at her, at the place on her face where the bruise had been gone now, healed. But some men look for the spot anyway out of habit. He said, Nora. She said nothing. He said, I came to see how you were getting on. And then, after a pause, I also came because it turns out there's some question about the deed transfer. My lawyer says there may be grounds to revisit. She said, there are no grounds, Lester. He said, my lawyer says different. She said, your lawyer works for you. That's what he's paid to say. Lester Voss looked from her to me. He said to me, this doesn't concern you. I said, she's under my roof. It concerns me. He said, what is she, your property now? Bought and paid for at auction. He said it with a particular sneer, and I understood what he was doing. He was trying to put me in a position where defending her looked like possession. I said, she's a person working under a legitimate contract who is not interested in speaking with you. You can either accept that and ride out, or you can sit on that horse a while longer and we can talk about what happens next. I said it quiet. I wasn't holding the maul in a threatening way. I'd actually set it down again, leaning it against the splitting block. But I was standing the way I stand when I've settled something internally, and men can generally read that. He looked at me for a long time. He was calculating. I could see it happening, that same assessment I'd seen in the ring 100 times. A man measuring whether the distance between what he wanted and what it was going to cost him was one he wanted to cross. He decided it wasn't. He said, this isn't finished. I said, ride safe, Mr. Voss. He turned the horse and rode out. I didn't watch him go. I turned to Nora. She was looking at me. Her arms were crossed, which she did when she was holding herself steady. I'd learned that about her. Her jaw was set. But her eyes had something in them that I hadn't seen before, not clearly. She said, he'll come back. I said, maybe. She said, he doesn't let go of things easily. I said, neither do I. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, thank you. And then before I could say it wasn't anything, don't tell me it was nothing, it was something. I saw how he looked at you. He would have pushed harder with anyone else. I said, he sized me up and made a decision. She said, he did, and I saw what he decided. She looked at me straight, the measuring look, but different from the way she'd measured me at the auction fence. That had been defensive. This was something else. I'd like to know how many men are going to come off that road and make a decision like that just from looking at you. I said, most of them. She said, good, and she went back inside. I stood in the yard for a moment. Then I picked up the maul and went back to splitting wood. The second thing that happened in January, I almost didn't tell you about because it's harder to explain. A stray came to the place. A dog, or what had been a dog before something difficult had happened to it. Some kind of sheep-dog mix, brown and white, thin enough that I could count the ribs through the coat. It appeared one morning just at the edge of the yard, and it stood there and looked at me. I'd been without a dog since Cobb died in the frozen ground 4 years back. I'd thought about getting another one and never done it, for reasons I probably would have said were practical, but were maybe not only practical. I went back inside. I got some scraps from the supper pot, cold potato, and some bone ends, and I went back out and put them down about 6 feet from the dog, and then I stood back. The dog looked at the scraps, looked at me, approached the scraps like it was a negotiation, ate everything in about 30 seconds, and then sat down and looked at me again. I didn't name it that day. I just went back to my work. Nora asked about it that evening. She said, where did the dog come from? I said, showed up. She said, does it have a name? I said, not yet. She looked at me for a moment. She said, are you going to keep it? I said, I guess we'll see what the dog wants to do. She nodded slowly, like I'd said something that made sense on more than one level. The dog was still there the next morning, curled up against the south wall of the house where the morning sun hit first. I brought it more scraps. By the end of the week, it was sleeping in the barn and following me at heel. By the middle of February, I'd named it. I named it Nora. I told Nora Voss. Her name for the dog, not for her, I would not have presumed. I told her and waited. She went very still. She looked at me. I said, I thought about it a while. It was the right name for a dog that showed up bruised and thin and turned out to be steady and worth keeping. She looked at me for a long time. The lamp was between us, and the light came up warm on one side of her face. She said, Cord. Just my name, no sentence after it. I said, Nora. She got up from the table. She walked around the lamp toward me, and she stood in front of me, and she put both her hands on my face, warm, firm, careful, the way you hold something that you've decided to keep. She looked at me for a moment. Then she rested her forehead against mine, and we stood there in the kitchen in the cold January with the dog whose name was also Nora sleeping against the warm side of the stove, and that was all. It was enough. Lester Voss did come back. In March, and not alone, he brought his lawyer from town, a small, dry man with a briefcase, and another fellow, a younger one who had the look of hired muscle. They came on a Thursday. I saw them from the south pasture. I'd been out there since first light doing repairs on what the winter had knocked loose. And I came in at a walk, not a run, because running would have announced something. They were in the yard when I came through the gate. Nora was at the house door, not inside on the step, which was her choosing, and I noted it. The lawyer was talking. Voss was sitting the dun horse again. The younger man was off his horse and standing in the yard, and he'd positioned himself slightly between me and the other two. I said, Good morning. The lawyer said he had papers regarding the Voss property transfer and would like to speak with Mrs. Voss. Nora said from the step, I've seen those papers. My own lawyer has seen them. He says the same thing mine did in December. The lawyer said his opinion differed. Nora said, Your opinion is purchased, mine is not. The younger man said something to me that I won't repeat, about the arrangement at the ranch and what he assumed I was getting out of it, said it in a particular tone. I looked at him. He was maybe 25. He had that particular confidence of a young, large man who has never been seriously tested. I said, Say that again. He did. I put the fence pliers I was carrying into my coat pocket. I looked at Lester Voss. I said, I've been a retired man for 22 years. I'd like to stay retired. Voss said, Then step back. I said, Your boy needs to think harder about what he's saying. The young man came 2 steps toward me. Now here is the thing about 22 years. You don't lose it. The body doesn't forget. What you lose, maybe, is the willingness and the callous around caring. What you gain, though, and this is true, is that you get slower to start, and that slowness is a kind of strength because you don't waste anything. I didn't throw a punch. I want to be clear about that. What I did was, I put my hand on that young man's chest when he came the second step toward me, one hand flat, and I stopped him. And I held him there. Not hitting, not grabbing, just stopped him. And I looked at him close, and he felt what I was, the whole of it in that one hand on his chest, 22 years of retirement sitting on top of what was underneath. He stopped moving. I said quietly, looking at his eyes, I would like for you to take a step back. He took a step back. Lester Voss looked at this. The lawyer looked at this. There was a long silence. I said to Voss, The papers are not going to change anything. She has a lawyer. Her lawyer has replied. You want to take this further, it goes through lawyers, not through here. If I see you on this property again without prior arrangement, I'm going to ride to town and have a conversation with the sheriff that you will not enjoy. Voss looked at me for a long time. He said, The woman isn't worth this kind of trouble. I said, I think you mean I'm more trouble than you're willing to have. He said nothing. He turned the horse and left. The lawyer went after him. The young man got on his horse and looked at me once, and then rode out. Nora came down off the step. She came to where I was standing in the yard. She looked at my hand, the one I'd put on the young man's chest, and she took it in both of hers, and she looked at the knuckles, the ridged lines, the sideways-heeled metacarpal on the right, and she held it like something of value. She said, You didn't hit him. I said, I didn't need to. She said, No, you didn't. She was looking at my hands still. When I first saw your hands at the auction, I thought they were the most frightening thing I'd seen in a long time. I said, And now? She looked up at me. She said, Now they're the thing I trust most. We stood in the yard in the March cold, the sun trying to come out from behind a bank of high cloud, her hands holding mine, and the dog Nora came out of the barn and sat down about 5 feet away and watched us with that solemn attention dogs bring to moments they seem to understand are important. The 6 months ran out at the end of March. I didn't bring it up. I wasn't going to be the one to bring it up, because if she needed to go, I wasn't going to make it harder by being the one who raised the subject and made her say it in front of me. She brought it up herself on the evening of March 28th. We were at the table. She had the Dickens and I had the Wyoming legal history, and the lamp was between us and the dog was at my feet. She set the book down. She said, "The term is up in 3 days. I said, "I know." She said, "I've thought about it." I said, "All right." She said, "I'd like to stay." She paused. "Not under the arrangement. I mean, I'd like to stay as a different thing." Another pause. "If that's something you'd want." I said, "I'd want that." She said, "You should know that I am not easy. I've been told that. I have opinions and I'll say them and I don't like being managed." I said, "I've noticed that." She said, "I'm not going to be soft about it and then become something else 6 months in. I'm exactly what I've been since September." I said, "Nora." She said, "What?" I said, "You are exactly what I'd want, since September." She looked at me, long look straight on, the lamp between us. She said, "All right then." We went back to our reading. After a while she moved her chair, not 6 inches this time, but all the way around the table, dragging it on the floorboards, settling it next to mine, and sat down and opened her book again, and the dog shifted at my feet and settled, and the lamp held. We married in May. In Millhaven, at the courthouse, which was not a romantic setting, but Nora said she didn't need a church wedding, and I didn't have strong feelings about it, and the judge who did the ceremony was a decent man named Holloway who kept it brief and genuine. After we went to the dry goods and she bought calico for new curtains, and I bought better coffee beans and the collar for the dog who by then needed it. She'd grown into herself, the dog, filled out, and Nora said it was undignified for a dog to go without a collar once she was a proper size. We drove home in the late afternoon, the May sun doing what it does in May in this country, which is something worth seeing, long and golden across the grass, the creek glinting when we crossed it, the house sitting quiet on the land the way a house should when it belongs where it is. She'd put new curtains up the week before in anticipation. Blue calico, a lighter blue than the dress from the auction, which she'd mended twice and wore still, practicality being one of her convictions. We unhitched Walter and I got him settled in the barn and she fed the chickens, and when I came back to the house the lamp was lit and I could smell supper going. The dog was at the step. I stopped at the step and looked at the lit window and the blue curtains and the dog sitting there like she was waiting for me to understand something, and I stood there for a moment before I went in. I've been asked in the years since what it was that changed me. Not the fighting, I was done with fighting before any of this. What changed me in the larger sense, the sense that a man sometimes doesn't know he needs changing until he's on the other side of it and can see where he'd been standing. And I say, a woman at a north fence on a Wednesday in September, bruised and careful and with everything she owned in a flour sack, who looked at my hands and saw not just what they'd done but what they could do, who called them the thing she trusted most. That will change a man. Not make him soft, not make him smaller than he was. Change him the way good tools get changed by good work, worn to fit, settled into use, worth something. I went in and the door swung shut behind me on its good hinges, and the dog scratched to come in, and I let her.